Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Seems like a few people are trickling in. Well, I just want to say hello and welcome. I'm your host, Ben Trollinger, editor of AcresUSA magazine. And today we're celebrating the launch of a new book from AcresUSA called A New Farm Language: How a Sharecropper's Son Discovered a World of Talking Plants, Smart Insects, and Natural Solutions. The book's author, Dr. W. Joe Lewis, is with us today, of course, but Joe being Joe, he also wanted to invite a few of his friends. And so we're thrilled to be joined by economist and author John Ikerd. John, who wrote the foreword to A New Farm Language, is professor emeritus of agricultural economics at the University of Missouri. He's also the author of Sustainable Capitalism, A Return to Common Sense, and Small Farms Are Real Farms. Also joining our panel today is Alton Walker, a Georgia farmer with an extensive background in agricultural consulting, forestry, and entomology. Like Joe, Alton grew up in a small farming community in Mississippi, and their paths eventually crossed at Mississippi State University back in the 1960s, where Alton was working on his master's degree in entomology. He eventually went on to complete his PhD in that subject at Clemson University in 1972, and he's featured prominently in Joe's new book. Joe Lewis spent his career in entomology with the USDA Agricultural Research Service at the Tifton campus, University of Georgia. His focus was on unlocking the secrets of how plants and insects communicate with each other, particularly how plants use SOS signals to recruit beneficial insects to their defense. Based on those groundbreaking insights, Lewis and his colleagues developed holistic and sustainable approaches to pest management within agricultural systems. In 2008, along with his colleagues, John A. Pickett and James H. Tumlinson, Lewis received the prestigious Wolf Prize in Agriculture. Although Joe Lewis has published papers in many academic and scientific journals, A New Farm Language is a valedictory statement on a lifetime of scientific achievement, as well as a testament to his enduring curiosity about the natural world, a curiosity that began on a small cotton farm in Mississippi. Before we begin our talk, I'd like to invite everyone to enter any questions into the Zoom chat. There will be time for a brief Q&A at the end of the discussion. And with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists, John Ikerd, Alton Walker, and Joe Lewis.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. Well, Joe, I thought we'd begin with you. Could you describe the kind of farming you grew up with and contrast that with the modern industrial agriculture we see today? I'm also interested in how this correlates to the erosion of rural communities. That's one of the major themes in the book.
Yes. It's a huge question, a very good one. And what's key and important about it is we're talking about two vastly different subjects, and they have both the personal interest side, that is what life is like just from an individual growing up in the way that I did versus the current, as well as the farming technology itself. And I'll touch on both of those a little bit, actually the distinctions in the farming aspects as just what the aspects of life is like in these two very vastly different environments. And I wanted to say before I start that I am honored to have John, who I feel fortunate to have some backup in here because he's been down this road a lot himself. I know that he grew up that way, and so did Alton. And Alton and I have been experiencing and dealing with these two sides of the argument on his own personal farm. So I'm delighted to have both of you guys with me. One, I want to say that, you know, for a kid with a curiosity, the way I grew up, completely away from the commotions of commercial activities of any type, was hugely different. We were truly embedded into nature itself, in which I do think helped me later as a scientist to understand and to see and to observe better, because in that type of life that we lived in, John, growing up, you were a part of nature. And now that's not something that you are part of at all. We're completely isolated from it. But what, from another side, seldom do you have anyone now in today's environment that really knows the processes all the way from the land to the food on the table. They may know some of them, but the way I grew up, and I know my sister is one of the only audience out there somewhere, we had talked about that recently. We would sit at the table, my parents and my sister, myself, and everybody at the table was a part of all the processes of the food that we're eating itself, from the milk and the butter and the churning of the butter and the milking the cow, from the meat that was maybe a butchered yearling or a swine and cured in the smokehouse. The entire process of growing the produce and processing it and putting it on the table. And that's just something totally unheard of now. You see some talk about farm to table, but it's nothing like that. Also, the garden and the food that we ate there, canning, all these things we were familiar, because there were few things that came from outside to go on the table other than a few staples of them. So it was kind of, I'm often reminded, I use in the book the statement by in the statement that it was the worst of times. Charles Dickens' statement, it was the worst of times, but yet the best of times. It was a rugged life, harsh when we had no running water, no modern conveniences of any time, but life was very good because you were close to nature and there was a good aspect to it. So now, we probably farmed about 50 acres total. And we had cotton, corn. Cotton was the only cash crop, but corn we would grow to feed our cattle. When I say cattle, it wasn't many, 5 or 6, 2 milk cows, 1 mule. Everything on that you did to grow the crop was by hand, but our cash crop was 5 acres. And after you paid the landlord a third to a fourth, maybe a half even in some instances for the use of the land, what you had left over is what you had to get anything else that you needed away from the farm. But we lived in a community where you were, even though it was rural, every few miles there was another farm, because it was 50 to 100 acres would be what the farms were. So we had a strong rural community, and you had the feed and seed stores and other things, crossroad grocery stores and so forth. That was the crossroads of the community. So you had a social life, and that was the way everybody lived. We were independent. There wasn't a food security issue like you have today. So it's very different, both from a personal quality of life as well as the nature of the farming and everything. You just don't have a nature of farming now that involves all those aspects from the production to the table. And what's happened in the current day, you have a very centralized system and you have huge production. I don't want to take too much time, but you carried it, and we can come back to that when you said compare it to the modern day farming, but I don't want to go let John kick in here a little bit, and we can come back to talking about how it's so different today.
Absolutely. John Ikerd, you had a childhood similar to Joe's. You both grew up in rural places. You both grew up in close to nature. You both have witnessed the disintegration of farm communities. Could you expand a little on what Joe said and maybe what struck you about his book?
Yeah, I think, we had similar life and really professional experiences as well. And we've come, at this stage in our career in life, we've come to very similar conclusions. As Joe said, we grew up limited economic circumstances. Most people would call that poor. You know, Joe was the sharecropper family. My dad had a fourth grade education. He bought and paid for a farm that he bought during the Great Depression. We worked hard, and you know, we didn't have electricity, running water, things of that nature, and it was a small dairy farm eventually. But the thing was that the places that we grew up within the families and within the communities, those were good places to live in spite of the, you know, the economic circumstances. And rural communities were considered to be good places to live and good places to raise a family. And it was a place where, you know, common ordinary people like our parents could make a decent living. But over time, we saw all of that change. Through our professional career and mine since then, you know, since I retired, we've seen the loss of the family farms that supported those rural communities. And farmers, you know, it's very difficult to make a living on a family farm these days. And with the loss of family farms, we saw the demise of the rural communities, and we saw the decay of the rural cultures. And I think Joe and I both reached the conclusion that those things were not necessary, and they weren't inevitable. They were simply the results of a particular way of thinking. And that way of thinking was that the world works like a big mechanism, and with all of the various parts. If you want to understand how it works, you take it apart and you look at the parts and you figure out if you've got a problem, you fix a part, replace it, and put it back together, and things of that nature. And so that's what led the understanding. And that's what Joe writes about in the books. He calls it a reductionist approach to science, where you reduce the whole to the individual parts, and you study the parts, and you try to tinker with specific causes and effects. And it's that science that provided the foundation for the industrialization of agriculture and the focused preoccupation on economics. And the basic problem is that we're trying to deal with problems that were problems of the systems as a whole by tinkering with the individual parts. And in reality, nature doesn't work like a mechanism, at least not the living thinking parts of it. It works like a big living organism. And the other thing is that we're a part of that. The farm of the plants, the animals are all part of that interconnected parts of it. And you can't just do one thing. Every time you tinker with one part, you're affecting everything else within that system, and it's all interconnected. You can't do one thing. And every time you do think something to solve a problem within a system, you risk creating another problem. There's always unintended consequences because you don't know everything you're doing just because you know one thing you're doing. And Joe saw that consequence in the treadmill of pesticides. You use a particular pesticide to kill a pest, you create another problem with another pest and have to use another pesticide, and pretty soon you're using more and more pesticide and you got more and more pests. And I saw it when you focused on just the economic part of farming. You focus on farm economics and you're creating social problems, you're creating environmental problems at the same time. And you're also, you find out that the more you increase the economic efficiency of agriculture, the more you have to increase it even more because it puts more and more pressure. And that's how we come to larger and larger farms and fewer farmers and the decline and decay of rural communities. And you know, if we're going to really fix the problems that we have to address the problems of systems as part of the whole. We have to understand, as Joe has talked about here, that the problems are in the whole of nature. It's our relationship with nature. We have to understand that we're part of it. And science needs to focus on how nature works so that we can work with it. Economics needs to focus on how can we meet our needs in a way that's consistent with what nature needs so that we can sustain the economic productivity over the long run. And it's not just about insects in the fields or entomology or economics. It's about families, it's about communities, it's about societies as a whole. And that's what Joe writes about in the book. You can't even separate the scientist from the science. It's all interconnected. That's what Joe talks about.
Now come back to being disciplined. I know you're going to the question and tie this footnote to what John is saying, because it's the highly industrialized farming which is highly reductionist and focuses on one crop or one commodity, maybe beef production, but in a very specialized way.
Yeah.
Versus what we had was a highly integrated chickens, cattle, crop, cotton, corn, all together compactly in an entire agro ecosystem on a, say, a 50-acre land area that we were, but all of that, chicken running behind, scratching in the manure, preventing things like fruit flies, but all of that interaction together, when you separate it and become a specialist in production of cotton or production of corn, you lose that interactive processes that John's referring to.
Yeah,
That's synergistic.
One thing that concerns me about this, Joe, is that what we have now, we have scientists, unlike you and I and Alton, that didn't grow up where you were interconnected with everything that's going on around you. You didn't grow up on diversified farms. And we have the scientists then that are doing the science, and we have decision makers that are making decisions with no sense of that interconnectedness. And that relates to the statement that you have, that disconnect is the greatest threat to survival. We've got to find some way to get people reconnected with nature and reconnected with each other.
Well said, John. Joe, I thought we could transition a little bit to some of your scientific work. So the book is really about drawing a line from your sort of humble beginnings in Mississippi on this farm to your work as a scientist. And I was wondering if you could give us a synopsis of your scientific work studying plant and insect communication. I'm curious to hear more about how your findings have informed your vision for an agriculture that's based in ecological balance and interaction. And in the book, you contrast that approach with interventionist methods that are favored today by conventional farmers, which we just sort of alluded to. But you kind of walk us down that trail. How did your sort of scientific interests develop, and what did you discover once you sort of narrowed that down?
Sure. Well, our model that we worked with was parasitic insects that attack primarily caterpillars. There are parasitic insects that attack all different stages of host insects and caterpillars and many other kinds of insects. But our model was caterpillars in the way of armyworms and bollworms, and the things like cotton crop was one of our keys. So it was the plant with primarily cotton, the caterpillar stage, and the parasitic insects that were little wasps that parasitize them. The key, and they serve as biological control agents to keep pests within balance. They don't eliminate them, but they keep them below economic threshold. We wanted to understand how that process occurs, because we felt in order to have reliable biological control, natural systems functioning good, we needed to know how those parasitic wasps could possibly find a sneaky caterpillar feeding on some plant hidden in some crevice somewhere in a huge cotton field. So that was what our studies was about. And historically, there's been a mindset that's far too simplistic in understanding these little parasitic insects, that they just were like a little machine and they just did everything by instinct and hovered around and searched. And we found it was completely different. They have an incredible ability, a sense of smell and vision, and they actually were able to significantly improve through learning, true learning, which we could talk about in more detail, but that was an astonishing finding. But then we found this incredible other thing, that the plant and the parasitic wasp become allies. And the plant, when it's under attack by a caterpillar feeding on it, it detects this, that it's under attack with a sensory system, and begins to emit things like an SOS signal. It's like a smoke screen being emitted. We don't see it, but the parasitic insect is, this plant actually sends a signal, a distress call, and the parasitic wasp comes to the aid. And then, so it's a cat and mouse game going on between the plant, the caterpillar, and this parasitic wasp that's taking place. And as we began to unravel it, it was kind of like a game of espionage and conspiracies and all going on. So the plant, but the mere fact that the plant actually emits these kind of signals for the purpose of sending out the signal to the good guy, it was just astonishing within the field of science and highly acclaimed. But not only did they send out the signal, there are many different kinds of caterpillars and other insects feeding. They customized that signal specifically for each different pest, because there's different kinds of natural enemies. It's just very complex in a way, but it's kind of like going into the shop in the supermarket and you get a barcode, a little bit of different blend. They have a blend of chemicals, and that blend is a little different for each plant feeder that feeds on it. So it's telling these parasitic insects and other predators, hey, your host is feeding on me. This is what it is. Come get it off my back. And finding this, discovering this, completely changed. And that's what the Wolf Prize was basically around, is the fact that understanding this system demonstrate that the built-in defense system was far stronger, more powerful than we had ever imagined. And a lot of the explanations for pest outbreaks is because something was not functioning just right about that system. And when we understand it, we can adjust that, and defense is built in an incredibly powerful way, much stronger than any pesticide that you get. We found it actually in some modern varieties of cotton and other crops. We were losing this attribute because we didn't know it existed. And in other cases, we were just disrupted. For example, if you get too much nitrogen, you could disrupt this system in many other ways by understanding that. And that's what John and I were talking about. Rather than coming with an external intervention with a pesticide, where possible, is far more powerful just to say, why is this pest a pest? What's out of balance? And then redesign that system so it just takes care of itself.
Great, thanks so much. Alton, how has your scientific background informed the way you farmed? You grew up in a rural area, but you're sort of a latecomer to full-time farming. I think Joe was telling me that it's in 1996, but you have this sort of academic scientific background, and I'm curious how that's aligned with Joe's work and the things that you learned during your career, and specifically, how that's informed your ecological, biological approach to farming.
From the time Joe and I were together at Mississippi State until the mid-90s, we saw each other often, and we talked, but mostly just banal talk. And then in the mid-90s, I attended a crop production meeting in Tifton, and about 2 blocks from Joe's laboratory. So in the morning break, I walked over and started talking to him and talked about some problems I had seen with insecticide, where we had sprayed parts of the field, or maybe spot sprayed the field, maybe put out a higher rate than we should have. And in those places, the non-target insect sometimes completely defoliated the cotton, or took all the fruit off the cotton. We knew it couldn't just be because of the beneficial, because beneficial are highly mobile, and this was right to the row. One row was completely denuded, the next row had no damage. And Joe told me that it was probably that the insecticide had blocked the plant's ability to cry out for help from his allies, the beneficial insects. So with that, I learned a new concept in biology, so anyway, about 4 or 5 hours later, I went back over to the meeting after talking with Joe for that time with a renewed friendship, and really proud to find out some new concepts of biology. So, a short time later, Joe and I were involved in a research project where we compared the activity of beneficial insects in field that had a grass cover crop on them the winter before with the fields that were conventionally tilled. And the results of those, that research really showed me that the cover crop had a huge positive effect on the beneficial activity. And with that, I decided I would start farming with one objective, and that was to establish a method of cotton production that was both economical and without the use of insecticides. So Joe had done some earlier research work with that showed that crimson clover was one of the better host plants for insects. So I just used that as a monoculture and my cover crop. And really the thing was very successful the first few years. We used no insecticide except we put down timic for thrips, which we thought we had to do. Later years, we found out we didn't need that at all. And so maybe 3 or 4 years there, we went along great without using any insecticide. And then we couldn't get conventional cotton. I had to use BT cotton. For the next several years, I had to spray 2 or 3 times for stink bugs. Had no idea what was causing that problem. So Joe and I were involved with I was involved with him, some other people with another research project where we saw that diversified cover crops would greatly improve our beneficial in the field. So I started growing several different cover crops, including grass, clover, some other broadleaf. Main thing, one of them that I really liked was wild mustard, which we've spent a lifetime trying to fight here and keep out of our fields. And I just had one cover crop. I want it to be wild mustard. It's very deep rooted and has lots of insects on it. And it's just great for us. And we had just started in the field, started where it produced the best cotton. So after using that multiple cover crops for a few years, perennializing my system, having something growing on the land at all times. After a few years, apparently the system got in balance more, and I no longer had to spray for stink bugs or any other pests. So last 3 or 4 years, I used no insecticide. So with that, my farm had been very successfully, both ecologically and economically. In fact, it had been highly successful. And some other farmers in the area noticed what I was doing. And last year, I put in a 30-acre demonstration plot on the farmer's property. And this year, he has 300 acres of it. So 3 additional farmers are adopting these same practices this year. So it will be myself and 4 other farmers using these same practices on 1,200 acres instead of the 600 that I've been using them on. So
Great. Thanks so much, Alton. I really appreciate that. Joe, you spent your career very closely observing parasitic wasps, among other things, and yet you were able to sort of develop this holistic ecological view of nature and agriculture. We talked a little bit about reductionism, but I'm curious how you sort of arrived at that point of view. It's not always something that every scientist comes to believe or see. What was the influence for you in coming to see the world that way and science that way?
Basically, what I'm understanding you saying, why did I not, as often takes place in science, go more reductionist as I got into those studies rather than moving more toward holistic? And that's a good point. And the reason to a great extent was that as I worked with a chemist colleague like Jim Tomlinson and on farm situations, like in the case of Alton. And rather than getting one organism and getting, kind of like a heart specialist, really getting into understanding how the heart works, we were working more at the intersections between plant, the herbivore and the natural enemy. And we saw the richest discoveries were at these points of intersections, not in the organism itself. We began to see the fact that if you took a parasitic wasp and you were wanting to understand how they find their host insect, the moment you unplug them from that natural environment in the field and put them in a cage in the laboratory, you have a different creature. So your studies in that more isolated environment rather than in the natural situation is completely incomplete. So we began to just do all our studies around one system and continuing to grow it in a holistic and to study it as a system. And the more we did that, the richer it became and the more accelerated a lot of our discoveries, because we began to find things that we would not have had we not studied it in a holistic way. It's just the way things turn out. And I will attribute some of that was to the way I grew up. When you grow up as a child and you're exploring the world and you're close to nature, you have an ability to observe things and to see indications of something different and new that you don't have. And I think that's as a extreme caution. That there's an author, Richard Love, that wrote a book, The Last Child in the Wood. And he points out how that most children now, as they sit around playing with electronic games and other things, they spend less than few minutes in the nature, seeing nature during a day and multiple hours on electronic media. And that is contributing immensely to our loss of connection with nature. And that's why I'm saying this is so risky. And one of the greatest, we've got to reconnect and work as parents to reconnect our children to the natural world. It's both more healthy and it allows us to understand these things in a way that's much more powerful. And I want to conclude with this, that what we see, the different in the approach is this: in the modern industrial agriculture approach to things, when you see something like a pest outbreak or some other undesired variable that's occurring, in the same way that it occurs in medicine, if you got some symptom having more infection or pain, the best answer that's going to sustain comes from within the system. We have a tendency in the modern world is to solve it with an external intervention, a therapeutic intervention, a painkiller, an antibiotic, a pesticide, when that has to be the second team, something that you can use only for a short term. The long-term sustainable answer can only come from within the system. Redesigning, say, why is this pest a pest? Why is this infection continuing to occur? Whatever it's, and redesign the system so that you remove it, rather than, you can use the solution intervention for short term, but never a long term.
So John Ikerd, I'm curious, I think there's sort of a mischaracterization of organic sustainable farming as being unscientific or sort of a folk way within agriculture. But Joe's work, as outlined in this book, seems to suggest that there's actually quite a bit of information out there that lends credence to an approach to farming that's ecological and holistic. What struck you about the book when you were reading it, particularly Joe's scientific insights, that sort of it reinforced or challenged your particular worldview?
Well, I think it reinforced my worldview, but I think it's very interesting and very important because I think it also reinforces with the point that you just made, is that organic sustainable agriculture really requires a very sophisticated understanding and a very intense knowledge base. I've often told people, I said, unless you would really think that farming is what you want to do with your life, don't try to become a sustainable, organic, regenerative farmer, because it's going to be one of the most intellectually demanding things that you could possibly do to try to understand how these systems working so you can work with them. And I think what Joe showed is the scientific community, if we get it oriented around in a different direction, has a lot to contribute to this. And that when we work with the systems like Joe's talking about here, the natural systems, we move away from that short-term innovation, which we have to do for long-run sustainability. Nature can sustain the productivity of agriculture and society as long as the sun shines, if we learn how to work with nature rather than trying to overcome or dominate nature. And I think if we can make that mind shift, and Joe's proven that the most sophisticated of science is contending to confirm some of the things that people have known sort of intuitively, that it's all interconnected, it's very complicated, but if we can learn to work with it, then it can sustain people and we can sustain each other. We need to apply that, not just within agriculture, but across the whole of society. We need to understand the economy has to function with community and with society, and all that has to function with nature. It all has to come together. And that's a tremendously intellectually challenging task ahead of us, but it's one that we can't afford not to take on.
And I think it's demonstrated on it is kind of a concluding from my viewpoint that in Alton's own farm work, it's become very important to me because we could see these things happen, but to have an actual grower put his money where his mouth is, actually develop. And I think this is what Alton can tell you, it works when you perennialize your system. That is, rather than clean tilling, intervening with the plow and the way you make a crop and avoid weeds and pests, is to just hammer them out and come in a powerful way with all our modern tools, is to actually go in and work with nature, rebuild the cover crop, the health of the soil. It works, and you can, with heat, at the point that Alton, you do not have to have insecticides much at all. You've been able to reduce your petroleum input with the number of passes, the many other ways that he's been able to make his fields more healthy, his farm more healthy, and to back out of this treadmill. It works.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the farmer as a scientist in a way, a citizen scientist, an observer, a keen observer of the land. Wendell Berry talks a lot about everything turning on affection, which is another way of saying familiarity or love. And I'm kind of curious to hear more maybe from Alton and the rest of the panelists about sort of that disconnect between, as Joe mentioned earlier, children who have what Richard Louv characterized as nature deficit disorder. And, really a lot of what you've done is spent a lot of time paying very close attention to natural phenomena. And that's what farmers do, right, Joe?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The good ones.
Absolutely. And
we pay attention.
Pay attention, right. Well, speak to that, Alton.
We pay attention that so long in my career, I've worked with commercialized agriculture and was really happy working there until I saw that that the thing was not sustainable. And but you can start anywhere you want to with pesticides, soil quality, soil loss, or whatever. We're losing ground in all areas. When we first started with pesticides and fertilizer, just a little bit gave us a huge increase in production. But with time, we've had to increase those inputs at a higher cost. Everywhere, here where I farm, we only have about 6 inches of topsoil, and we lose, say, 1/10 of an inch a year. It takes 100 years, all of our topsoil will be gone. That's not sustainable. We can build the quality of this topsoil with
on that note, I thought we'd switch to Q&A very quickly. We have just a time for one question, and it's sort of a general question, but it's this: if there was a committed federal policy and popular movement, do you believe it's possible that a renewed, reinvigorated culture of family farming could be restored to the American landscape? Yeah, so it's kind of a solutions question, as we've sort of identified a problem, which is this reductionist mindset, this sort of industrial mindset. What needs to happen in order to sort of reinvigorate the rural culture that we once had?
I'd be glad to take that on to start with, because I think if we didn't have government support of foreign policies right now in terms of price support, subsidized crop insurance, and the whole range of things, including the public research and educational programs that support industrial agriculture, it would be obvious that that kind of agriculture is not sustainable, that it would collapse. I think we see, looking back to 2020, if you look at what the government paid out, it paid out between $46 and $47 billion to farmers to make up for the fact that industrial agriculture is very, very fragile and subject to collapse because of the way that it's created. That it's just all the focus on specialized, standardized, consolidate, make it work like a machine. So if we had a change in farm policies that really made it possible for these farmers that want to take care of the land, that love the land, that feel this sense of connection, that want to go out and be a part of communities and raise families there, if we had the kind of farm policies that made it possible for these young, smart people to go out here and do what they want to do with their life, you could see a change happen in a hurry. I saw the change from supporting family farms to supporting industrial agriculture in the late 60s and 70s. And I said, the chemical and biological technologies that came out of World War II made industrial agriculture possible. What made it inevitable was that change in government policies. If we had a change in government policies now, we know more about how to replace industrial agriculture than we did about industrial agriculture when we had that first round of change in policy.
Yeah.
And
thanks, John. Joe, you have the last word on this.
Basically all the policies that have supported this industrial agriculture has been on the basis that we've got to do this to feed the world. We know that cannot possibly work, because number one is we see that the system, and what you may see higher production, but the net benefit to the farmer, he's losing money because the cost to achieve that is going up faster than the production, as well as the impact on our natural environment is being. And on top of that, you can't produce it in these big farms and ship it. You've got to build a system where people who need the food, where there's hunger, can produce it more effectively in their own region, in the locations, because the big portion of the world that is going hungry, they're only making $2 or $3 a day at the most on average. So they can't afford to buy from this high-end industrial agriculture production. It's wrecking our environment, and it's not sustainable, and it will not work on top of it. And it's wearing out our environment in the process.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists, and I also want to remind folks that Joe's book is for sale at AcresUSA.com. There is a discount, and you can look in the chat for information on that. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks, John. Thanks, Alton. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And thanks to everyone who attended this
And-
evening. We really appreciate your support.
And yeah, thanks Alton and John for participating.
And thanks, Joe, for a great book.
Thank
I
you.
don't need anything.
Come on.
I need to thank Joe for making my farm possible. I would
Yeah,
never
man.
farm without
There
him.
you go.
Could I mention, though, I do want to say something. I saw these little black and white sketches that's in the book.
Yeah.
Let me take the opportunity to say my thanks to Vincent Cassee, who drew those, and just point out that he, a couple of weeks ago, passed away. And he did a great job. I think they add a lot of nice flavor to the book that talks about how we grew up. It shows it well in the little sketches. And I appreciate the fact that Vincent Cassee contributed those.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And everyone have a great evening.
Thank you, Ben.